My name is Clara Whitfield, and I was 31 years old the afternoon my mother called to tell me that visiting my own father in the hospital was making things worse. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you'd explain a scheduling conflict. She said, "The doctor says stress is a factor. You know how you are." And then she moved on to asking whether I'd remembered to send a card. I had sent 4. I found out later nobody passed them along. I spent the next several months doing what I'd always done, quietly from a distance. I called the nurse's station when I couldn't reach anyone. I drove 3 hours on a Saturday because a coworker named Deb offered to come with me, and I didn't trust myself to do it alone. I sat in the parking lot because my mother had asked me to give it a little more time. What I didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father had already done something 9 months before the first symptom appeared that had nothing to do with his recovery and everything to do with what he decided a long time ago. I didn't find out until a woman confirmed a date in a room full of my family. I'll tell you what happened after that. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If you're new here, subscribe, and if you've ever been told you were the problem by the people who created you, drop a comment. I read every one. I grew up being the child who noticed things. Not in a dramatic way, not the kind of noticing that gets you credit or praise. I noticed when the water bill was higher than usual and mentioned it before my parents did. I noticed when my grandmother's handwriting changed on her birthday cards and said something about it to my mother, who told me I was overthinking. I noticed when the refrigerator started making a sound it hadn't made before, and I was the one who called the repair service and stayed home from school to let the technician in because both my parents worked and my sister Renee had dance practice. That was just what I did. I was the one who handled the small things nobody else wanted to handle, and in return I received something that wasn't quite appreciation, and wasn't quite respect. It was more like tolerance. The understanding that Clara would take care of it, and therefore Clara didn't need to be thanked, because thanking someone implies they did you a favor, and what Clara did was simply what Clara was for. I am telling you this not to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you this because it is important that you understand what kind of person I was before any of this happened, before I was told that my presence was medically inadvisable, before I spent a winter sending cards to a hospital address and wondering why my father never mentioned receiving them. I grew up in a house in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the older of 2 daughters. My mother, Diane, taught elementary school for 27 years. My father, Gerald Whitfield, worked for the county assessor's office for most of my childhood, and then transitioned into private property appraisal when I was in high school. He was a methodical man. He kept paper records of everything: utility costs, vehicle maintenance, the dates he changed the furnace filter. He had a filing cabinet in the basement that was color-coded by year, and he updated it every January with the same focused expression he gave to everything else. He was not a warm man in the way that word usually means. He didn't hug easily. He didn't say, "I love you," the way some fathers do, reflexively at the end of every phone call. But he was present in a way that mattered. He came to my college orientation, drove the 4 hours alone because my mother was at a teacher's conference, and he sat through the entire information session and took notes. He bought me a second-hand filing cabinet when I moved into my first apartment and dropped it off without being asked, set it up in the corner of my bedroom, and said, "You'll want to keep your lease agreements separate from your tax documents." That was Gerald Whitfield expressing love. I understood the language, even when other people couldn't hear it. My sister Renee is 4 years younger than me. She is the kind of person rooms organize themselves around, not because she demands it, but because she moves through the world with a certainty that other people find gravitational. She is funny and quick, and she always knew what to say at the right moment. My parents lit up differently when she walked in. I noticed that too from a fairly young age, and I made the choice that a lot of oldest daughters make. I decided to be useful instead of luminous. I decided that my value would be in reliability. What I didn't understand, until much later, was that reliability is very easy for a family to take for granted when they've never once had to go without it. After college, I studied accounting at UConn, graduated, passed my CPA exam on the first try. I moved to Hartford. I took a position at a mid-sized firm that handled estate planning and business accounting for regional clients. It was not glamorous work. It was precise, careful, document-heavy work, and I was very good at it. I made associate within 3 years. I had a supervisor named Tom Breckenridge who told me once, unprompted, that I had the best audit instincts of anyone he'd worked with in 20 years. I kept that comment in the back of my mind on the days when I needed it. I drove home for holidays. I called every Sunday. I helped my parents file their taxes, reviewed their homeowners' insurance renewals when they asked, and once spent a long weekend helping my father understand the implications of a refinancing offer he'd received. He read everything I put in front of him carefully, asked good questions, and thanked me in the way he always thanked me, by handing me a folder of documents he'd already organized and saying, "I assumed you'd want copies." I kept those copies. I always kept copies. That is, it turns out, the kind of habit that matters.
2.
My father was 63 years old when he had his first cardiac event. It happened on a Wednesday morning in late October. He was at his desk doing a property appraisal write-up, and he felt what he later described as pressure behind his sternum that he initially dismissed as indigestion. He drove himself to the urgent care clinic. The urgent care clinic sent him directly to the hospital. My mother called me from the waiting room. Her voice clipped in the way it got when she was managing herself, and told me he was being evaluated and that they would know more soon. Asked if I should come. She said, "Let's see what they find first." They found a partial blockage. He had a procedure, a stent placed, nothing surgical, and was admitted for observation. I called back that evening. My mother told me he was resting and that the doctors were pleased with how the procedure had gone. I asked again if I should come. She said, "He's tired, Clara. He needs quiet right now." I said I understood, and I sent flowers and I waited. He came home 4 days later. I called him directly. I still had a cell number, the same number he'd had for 11 years, and he answered on the third ring, sounded tired but like himself, told me the hospital food had been aggressively mediocre, and said he was supposed to start cardiac rehab the following week. I asked if there was anything I could do. He said, "I don't think so. Your mother has it handled." I want to be precise about what happened over the next several months, because it happened in increments so small that each one individually seemed reasonable. The first thing was the visiting question. About 2 weeks after my father came home, I called to ask whether I could drive up for the weekend. My mother said, and I wrote this down afterward because I had already learned by then to write things down, the cardiologist has been very clear that he needs a low-stress environment while he's adjusting. You know how the two of you can get. I asked what she meant by that. She said, "You challenge each other. It's just your dynamic. It's not a criticism." I thought about the filing cabinet he had brought to my apartment. I thought about the Sunday calls. I said I understood, and I said I would wait until he was stronger, and I hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage under my office building for a while. The second thing was the cards. I started sending cards every week, not emails, physical cards, because I thought a physical card was something he could hold, something low effort to receive. I sent them to the house. Over a period of about 10 weeks, I sent 11 cards. He never mentioned them. I assumed he was conserving energy, not up to responding. I did not learn until much later that my mother had been collecting them from the mailbox and setting them aside, meaning to give them to him when the time was right. The time, apparently, was never right. The third thing was Christmas. I drove up on the 23rd unannounced, which I admit was a miscalculation, but I had called twice that week and gotten voicemail both times, and something had pulled at me in a way I couldn't explain. I knocked on the front door. My mother answered. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite anything else, and she said, "Clara, we talked about this." I said we hadn't talked about Christmas specifically. She said, "Your father had a hard week. Renee's here with the kids, and he's been enjoying the calm." She paused. "I think it would be better if you came back after New Year's, when things are quieter." Renee was there. Renee and her husband Marcus and their 2 children, who were 5 and 3, which is not, by most medical definitions, calm. I did not say that. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in my coat, on December 23rd, and I said, "Okay." And I drove back to Hartford. I stopped at a diner on Route 44 and ate dinner at the counter. There was a couple 2 seats down who had clearly just come from a Christmas concert of some kind. The woman still had a program in her hand, and the man behind the counter gave them free pie. He offered me a slice too. I said yes. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I think because it was one of those small kindnesses that lands harder than it should when you're having a particular kind of night. I drove home. I did not call my mother back. I made a note in my phone that said, simply, December 23rd. Send away from the door. 3. My coworker Deb Okafor has worked at the firm for 11 years. She is the kind of person who always notices when you haven't eaten lunch and puts a granola bar on your desk without comment. We are not the same kind of people. She is louder, more immediate, more likely to say the thing that everyone is thinking, but we understood each other in the way that people sometimes do when they've sat near each other through enough difficult filing seasons. Deb knew something was wrong before I said anything. She asked in late January on a Friday afternoon when the office was nearly empty, and I told her. All of it, the procedure, the visits I wasn't allowed to make, the cards, Christmas. She listened without interrupting, which is not naturally her style, and when I finished she said, "You should go." Not to ask. Just go. I said my mother had been clear. Deb said, "I'll drive." I want to pause here and acknowledge that this was not a small offer. Hartford to Bridgeport is about an hour and 15 minutes, and Deb had plans that Saturday. I knew she did. She'd mentioned them. She showed up at my apartment at 8:30 in the morning anyway, coffee in hand, and she drove. We didn't call ahead. My mother opened the door, and her expression cycled through several things in about 3 seconds. She said, "Clara?" Deb said very pleasantly, "Good morning. I'm Deb, Clara's coworker. We were in the area." This was completely untrue, and my mother knew it, but there was nothing to do with it. We were standing on the porch. My father was in the living room. I could see him from where I stood. He turned when he heard voices. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Clara,
come in.
There's coffee." My mother said, "Gerald," the doctor said. My father said, "Diane, there's coffee." Something loosened in my chest that had been tight for 3 months. I went inside. Deb sat with my mother in the kitchen and performed approximately 45 minutes of the most sustained small talk I have ever witnessed, covering topics including the Hartford Road construction schedule, a recipe for a chicken dish she'd recently made, and the relative merits of 2 competing brands of hand lotion. My mother had no idea what to do with her. It was, in retrospect, a masterclass. I sat with my father in the living room. He looked thinner than I'd expected. He was moving more carefully. But his eyes were clear, and he asked me questions about the firm, about a complicated estate case I'd mentioned on the phone in November, about whether I'd had the brakes on my car checked recently. I answered all of them. At one point he said quietly, "Your mother worries." I said I knew. He said, "That's not the same thing as being right." I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything. I just sat with it. We left after about 2 hours. On the drive back, Deb didn't say much. At one point she said, "He's proud of you." I asked how she could possibly know that. She said, "Because he asked you about your work for 40 minutes and didn't look at his watch once." I looked out the window and didn't answer. That was February. By April, my mother had established a new protocol. I was permitted to visit on specific Sundays for no more than 3 hours, with notice given at least 4 days in advance. I followed the protocol. I gave the notice. I drove down on the approved Sundays. My father and I sat in the living room and talked, and my mother circled through periodically with updates about his medications or reminders about what he was or wasn't supposed to eat, and the visits had the quality of supervised time, which I tried not to examine too closely. Renee visited whenever she felt like it. I know this because my father mentioned her visits casually, in passing, the way you mention something that doesn't require explanation. Renee was here Tuesday with the kids, or Renee stopped by, brought that soup your mother likes. I made note of each mention. I did not bring it up with my mother because by then I had a fairly clear picture of the logic being applied. Renee's presence was restorative. Mine was stressful. The cardiologist had apparently prescribed one and contraindicated the other. I was 31 years old. I had passed the CPA exam on the first attempt. I had reviewed my parents' financial documents for years. I had driven 3 hours uninvited in February because I needed to see my father's face, and I was being managed like a variable that needed to be controlled. I kept going on the approved Sundays. I kept making notes. I kept copies of everything, which is what I had always done, which is what my father had taught me to do, even if neither of us had ever said that out loud. 4. My father's estate planning was something I knew about in general terms. He had mentioned, years earlier, that he and my mother had updated their wills after my grandmother passed. This would have been when I was around 25. He'd said it in the matter-of-fact way he said most things. We got the paperwork in order. You should do the same. I'd filed this information away. I hadn't asked for details because it hadn't seemed like something I needed the details of yet, and because asking felt like the kind of thing that could be misconstrued. What I did not know, what nobody in my family had told me, and what I had no reason to suspect, was that my father had gone to see an attorney about 16 months before his cardiac event. This was in June of the year before. He had made an appointment on his own, told my mother he was going to a property appraisal consultation, and driven 40 minutes to an estate planning firm in New Haven. He had updated his documents. He had notarized them. He had filed them. And he had told no one. I found this out much later. But I want you to understand the timeline clearly because it is the entire spine of the story. My father signed those documents 9 months before his first symptoms appeared. He was not sick when he signed them. He was not under any kind of duress. He was 62 years old, working full-time, entirely lucid, and he made a deliberate choice about how he wanted to structure certain things. A notary named Patricia Eubanks witnessed his signature and affixed her seal. The date was June 14th. I did not know any of this in the spring following his procedure. What I knew was that my approved Sunday visits continued, that I was still not welcome at holidays, and that sometime in March my mother had mentioned to Renee, who had, to her credit, told me directly that the plan was for my parents to eventually move in with Renee and Marcus when the time came, since Renee had the space and the family situation to accommodate it. I want to be very precise about my reaction to this information. My throat tightened. I set down the coffee mug I was holding. And then I said, okay. Not because I agreed with it. Not because I didn't have thoughts about it. But because I had learned over that year that my thoughts were not what anyone was asking for. And because I needed to understand what the actual documents said before I said anything at all. I called an estate attorney I had worked with at the firm, not about my parents specifically, just a general conversation about how these arrangements typically worked, what documents governed what decisions, what rights an adult child had when decisions were being made about a parent's care. She walked me through the structures. I listened. I asked careful questions. I went home, and I made more notes. I kept going on the Sundays. I kept my voice level. I kept my face even. My father, for his part, had started looking better by late spring. Color returning. Moving more freely. He had completed his cardiac rehab and his cardiologist had been, by all accounts, pleased with his progress. We talked about his work. He had taken on 2 appraisal clients again, nothing heavy, and he asked about mine. He asked about Deb. He seemed to find Deb genuinely funny, which I understood. One Sunday in May he said, I need to tell you something. My hands went still on the armrests of the chair. He said, not today. I need to do some things first. But I want you to know that I've been thinking about you. About the situation. I want you to know that. I said, okay. He said, I keep my records organized. You know that. I said I knew. He said, good. And then my mother came in with a glass of water for him, and the conversation shifted, and he didn't say anything else about it. I turned that exchange over in my head for weeks. I kept the notes. I waited. The event was a family meeting. This is not the dramatic phrase it might sound like. It was not scheduled as a confrontation. It was, according to my mother's invitation, which arrived by text in early September, 9 months after my father's procedure, a family check-in about next steps for Dad's care. It was to be held at Renee and Marcus's house in Fairfield on a Sunday afternoon. Attendance was clearly expected. The phrasing of the text made this clear. My mother's texts always made the subtext very legible if you knew how to read them. I confirmed I would be there. I also, in the week before, called my father's estate attorney. Not the one I consulted with at the firm, but the one listed on a business card I had found years ago in the folder my father had given me the last time we'd done a tax review together. I had kept the card because I kept everything. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she was a partner at a firm in New Haven. I did not call to ask about my parents' documents. I called to introduce myself and to mention, carefully, that a family meeting was being scheduled to discuss my father's care arrangements and that I wanted to make sure, as a matter of due diligence, that any plans discussed at that meeting would be consistent with any existing documents my father had prepared. Helen Marsh paused for a moment after I said that. Then she said, "Ms. Whitfield, I think it would be very appropriate for our office to be represented at that meeting. Would you be able to get me the details?" I gave her the details. She said she would make some calls. I want to tell you what I did after I hung up the phone. I went to the kitchen. I made a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen table, and I looked out the window at the parking lot of my building, where two pigeons were having a disagreement about a piece of pretzel, and I thought about a filing cabinet in the corner of my first apartment. About a man who drove 4 hours alone to sit through a college orientation. About the way he'd said, "I keep my records organized. You know that." My face was entirely calm. Something behind my eyes was not. But I kept it where it was because there was still a week to go, and I had learned how to wait.
6.
Renee and Marcus's house is a colonial in Fairfield, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a kitchen that had been renovated 3 years before to accommodate what Renee called the reality of actually cooking for a family. It is a nice house. I had been in it twice. I arrived on time, exactly on time, which is what I always do. My mother's car was already in the driveway. My Uncle David's sedan was there, and a car I didn't recognize that turned out to belong to a woman named Patricia Eubanks, who was introduced to me by Helen Marsh when I walked in as the notary who handled your father's documents. I want to describe that moment precisely. I walked through the front door. Helen Marsh was standing in the hallway. She was 60-something, gray-haired, carrying a leather folio. Beside her was a woman I had never met, 50s, unremarkable, lanyard with a state seal on it. Helen said, "Ms. Whitfield, this is Patricia Eubanks. She notarized your father's estate documents." My Uncle David, who was standing nearby, turned and looked at the two women with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating. My mother, who was coming out of the kitchen with a platter of something, stopped in the doorway. She said, "Helen, I didn't know you were." Helen said, "Gerald called me this week. He asked me to attend." My father came down the hallway from the direction of the living room. He was moving well. He looked like himself, organized, deliberate, the same focused expression he gave to everything. He shook Helen's hand. He shook Patricia Eubanks's hand. He looked at me and gave me a small nod. We went into the living room. There were 9 people in the room. My parents, Renee and Marcus, my Uncle David and his wife, Carol, Helen, Patricia, and me. The children were upstairs with a babysitter. Marcus had set up chairs in a rough circle, the way you might for a therapy session or a very tense book club. My mother started. She had an agenda, which she stated aloud, which was very on brand. She said they were there to discuss Gerald's ongoing care needs, the practicalities of the house, and the long-term plan for making sure he had the right support as he continued to recover. She said, "We've been discussing the possibility of Gerald and her eventually transitioning to a suite in Renee and Marcus's home, which had the space and which would allow Gerald to have family support without the stress of managing a house." She said this had been discussed among the family and that everyone was aligned. My father said, "Helen." My mother stopped. Helen opened the folio.
7.
This is the part one want to be careful with because what happened next happened quietly, and the quiet is the point. Helen said that Gerald had contacted her office in the spring to request that she attend this meeting because he had become aware that planning discussions were occurring that might not be consistent with his existing estate documents. She said that in her view, and in Gerald's, it was appropriate to make the contents of those documents clear to all relevant parties before any formal decisions were made. She summarized the documents. She was efficient and precise. Gerald had prepared a comprehensive estate plan approximately 16 months prior to his cardiac event, durable power of attorney for finances, healthcare proxy, and an updated will. The documents were thorough, notarized, and filed with the New Haven probate court. I had been named as the primary financial power of attorney. I had been named as the healthcare proxy. In the will, I had been named the primary beneficiary of the house. a three-bedroom property in Bridgeport assessed at approximately $340,000, with Renee as secondary beneficiary for the remaining estate assets. My mother's face, when Helen read that last line, went a color I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't anger yet. It was something prior to anger, the moment when the mind is still trying to reconcile what it's heard with what it believed. Renee's hands went flat on her knees. My Uncle David looked at the floor. Marcus, to his credit, looked at nothing in particular and said nothing at all. Helen finished. She said that she wanted to be clear that these documents predated Gerald's illness by more than 9 months, and that she had asked Patricia Eubanks to attend for exactly that reason, to confirm the dates and circumstances of execution, should anyone have questions. Patricia Eubanks, who had the energy of a woman who had done this many times before, opened a folder of her own and said in a flat professional voice that she had notarized the estate planning documents for Gerald Whitfield on June 14th, 16 months prior. She confirmed the date. She confirmed Gerald had been present, had appeared fully lucid and uncoerced, and had signed of his own volition. She confirmed there was no question about capacity or circumstances. She closed the folder. My father said, "Thank you, Patricia." Patricia said, "Of course." My mother said, "Gerald." Just his name. Nothing after it. My father looked at her. He said, in the same voice he had used to tell me to come in from the porch that February morning, the voice that had not changed since I was a child, the voice that meant the conversation was over. I kept my records organized, Diane.
8.
The room was quiet for a long time. Renee was the first to speak. She said, and I want to give her credit, because this was not an easy thing to say in front of everyone. "Dad, I didn't know about this." Her voice was strained. Something in her throat was working. She said, "I didn't ask for her," and then she stopped. My father said, "I know. This isn't about you, Renee." She looked at him for a moment, and then looked at her hands. My mother, when she finally found her footing, said that she didn't understand why this hadn't been discussed, why Gerald had made decisions of this magnitude without consulting the family, why Helen was presenting this here instead of in private. Her voice had the cadence of someone who was framing outrage as reasonable process concern. It was a good technique, one I'd seen in professional settings. She said, "A family decision of this kind should involve all of us. We should have been part of this conversation." My father said, "I made the decision I wanted to make, at a time when I was completely well about my own affairs." She said, "Clara isn't equipped to." My father said, "Clara has been managing complex financial documents professionally for 8 years. She passed her CPA exam on the first attempt. She has reviewed every major financial decision I've made in the last decade. I'm aware of what she's equipped for."
I did not say anything.
I was sitting with my hands in my lap, and I was looking at my father, and I was thinking about a granola bar left on a desk without comment, and a man who drove 4 hours alone, and a filing cabinet in the corner of my first apartment. I was thinking about 11 cards that were never delivered. I was thinking about December 23rd and free pie at a diner counter on Route 44. My hands were perfectly still. My Uncle David said, quietly, "Gerald." He had the tone of a man who had known my father for a very long time and was choosing his words carefully. He said, "No one is questioning your right to make these decisions. I think what Diane is trying to say is that the family would have appreciated being included." My father said, "The family made a number of decisions over the past year that I wasn't included in either, David." David said nothing after that. The meeting ended without resolution, which is what I had expected. There was no dramatic walkout, no raised voices. My mother asked Helen several procedural questions about the timing of the documents taking effect, about whether anything could be amended, about the role of the healthcare proxy specifically. Helen answered each question directly and without editorial. Patricia Eubanks gathered her folder and said quiet goodbyes and left. Renee walked me to the door. In the hallway, out of earshot of everyone else, she said, "I didn't know about the cards. Mom mentioned she was holding them, but I didn't know she never gave them to him." I looked at her. Something behind my eyes was still doing what it had been doing all afternoon. that sustained internal stillness that is the opposite of peace but looks exactly like it from the outside. I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know that too." We didn't hug. We looked at each other for a moment, the way sisters sometimes do, across whatever distance has accumulated, and then I went outside. My father was standing by the driveway. He had come out through the side door, and he was holding his jacket, and he looked at me the way he always looked at me, like he was reading something he'd already decided was accurate. He said, "I mailed you a copy when I filed them." I said, "I never received it." He said, "I know. I had Helen confirm it last week." He paused. "I should have told you directly." I said, "It's okay." He said, "No. I let things go on longer than I should have. That's on me." I said, "You handled it." He gave a short nod. He said, "Drive safe." He went back inside. I sat in my car for a few minutes. Not long. Then I drove back to Hartford on the 95, which was backed up near Stratford, and I stopped at the same diner on Route 44 because it was on the way and I hadn't eaten since that morning. I sat at the counter and ordered a grilled cheese. The man behind the counter, a different man than the one from December, set it down without ceremony and moved on to the next customer. I ate it. It was fine. I drove home. The weeks after the meeting had a particular texture. My mother called me 4 days later. Her voice had shifted into a register I recognized, the one she used when she was repositioning, when she needed to reframe something she'd said or done without explicitly acknowledging having said or done it. She said she hoped I understood that everything she'd done during my father's recovery had been about what was best for him. She said she had never meant to make me feel excluded. She said, "You know, I've always said you and your father are alike. That's not a bad thing." I said I understood. She said she thought it would be good if we could all move forward together, and she wanted me to know that the door was always open, that she hoped we could find a way to be a family again. She said, "You're still my daughter, Clara. That doesn't change." I said, "I know, Mom." I did not say the other things I was thinking. I noted the conversation in my phone, as I had noted all the others, and I returned to my evening. My Uncle David called the following week. His approach was different, more direct, less repositioning. He said he owed me an apology for not asking questions sooner, and that he'd had a conversation with my father that had clarified things he hadn't understood before. He said, "Your dad's proud of you. He's never been good at saying it outright." I thanked him. Renee texted. The text was long and careful and said several things that I think she'd been trying to say for a while, about growing up in the same house, about the ways it had shaped both of us differently, about feeling like she'd benefited from a dynamic she hadn't fully understood until recently. I read it 3 times. I replied, "I appreciate this. Let's talk sometime." We have talked. It's been slow, but it's real. My father and I had dinner together in October, just the 2 of us. He drove up to Hartford, which he hadn't done in years. We went to a steakhouse he'd looked up and reserved in advance, which was very Gerald. He ordered the same thing I did. We talked for 3 hours. At the end, when he was putting on his coat, he said, "That attorney you consulted with in the spring, the one you talked to about family care structures." I said, "Tom mentioned it?" He said, "Helen mentioned it. She thought it was very prudent." He paused. "So did I." He drove back to Bridgeport. I stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant for a moment before going in to get my coat in the October air, and I thought about the word prudent and how it was coming from my father, the equivalent of about 1,000 other words. The house in Bridgeport is still my parents' home. Nothing has been transferred or invoked. There's no reason to. My father is well. His last cardiologist visit was, according to him, unremarkable, which is the best possible outcome. The documents are filed. The dates are confirmed. Things are in order. I still call every Sunday. The approved visit protocol has quietly dissolved. I come when I want to and I let myself in and I make coffee and my father and I sit in the living room and talk and my mother occasionally comes through and adds something to the conversation and there is still distance there, real distance, the kind that doesn't fully close, but there is also something that functions, again, as a family. I still have every card I sent. I found them last Thanksgiving In a box on a shelf in my mother's hall closet, still in their envelopes, in the order I'd sent them, with the postmarks intact. She had kept them. I stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the stack of them, thinking about what it meant that she'd kept them and also never delivered them, and then I put them back and went to find my father. Some things you understand. Some things you just carry. There's something I've thought about a lot since that September meeting. My father made those decisions, the attorney, the documents, the notarization, the filing, 9 months before his heart gave him a warning. He did it quietly, without telling anyone, without making it into a statement or a confrontation. He organized his records as he had always organized his records because he believed in the value of documentation and the importance of having things in order before they needed to be. He could not have known what would happen. He could not have known about the supervised visits or the undelivered cards or the December 23rd porch conversation. He was just doing what he had always done, making deliberate, thoughtful choices about the things that mattered and trusting that the paperwork would speak for itself when the time came. I am a CPA. I've spent my career understanding the weight of documents, what they prove, what they protect, what they say about a person's intentions when that person is no longer in the room to clarify. I know better than most people that a notarized signature on a dated document is a specific kind of statement. It says, I was here, I was clear, and this is what I decided. My father knew that too. He had known it for 50 years. He just needed the right moment for the room to hear it. That's my story. A filing cabinet, a stack of undelivered cards, and a date in June. If you've ever been the one who handled things while being told you were the problem, I want to ask you something.
Did you stay or did you go?
And if you stayed, what made you? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one and I want to know. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.